Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Bushido or Bust Student Perceptions of Samurai and What to Do with Them. Our leader for this session is J. Elijah Bender, Associate Professor of History, Concordia College. We are also joined by two of our Teacher Advisory Council members, Dan Barish out of Texas and Elizabeth Mulcahy out of Virginia. Thank you both for joining us. I see you both are active in the chat already. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. And I hope all is well with you and yours. Dr. Elijah Bender is an environmental historian specializing in pre-modern Japan. He's very interested in the causes of conflict and cohesion in society, and he primarily examines that topic through environmental disputes. Doing so brings a lot of interconnected historical forces together and offers a lot of potential avenues for research. He's currently working on a book that argues for the key influence of local conflict resolution mechanisms in shaping a widespread transition across the Japanese archipelago. He enjoys teaching immensely and finds it to be one of the most rewarding things about his profession. There are so many interesting things about history that he loves exploring with students. As fascinating as this historical content is, an even more important thing is that he wants to impart to students the value of thinking. History is a critical tool for understanding our world, and in order to explore history, you have to know how to dig up obscure information, process it with the critical eye, and be self-reflective about your own conclusions. Dr. Bender loves working through these complex cognitive tasks with students and cherishes those aha moments when their perception of the world grows richer. To all of our teachers who are here tonight, and without further ado, I present to you our leader for tonight's session, Dr. J. Elijah Bender. Dr. Bender, we are excited to hear your talk, and we're fortunate to have you here tonight. Looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I just wanted to say a few things before we get started. I noticed in the chat that someone had mentioned UT Austin as being having some great resources for teaching history, specifically Asian history. That would be the group that's led by my friend Mark Ravina at UT Austin. It is a terrific resource. They're doing wonderful things with digital history down there at UT Austin. So great recommendation there, whoever put that in the chat. I also saw, as Mike was going through the kind of lead up slides here, our very own Earl Lewis, who is a Concordia alum. If you don't know who Earl Lewis is, he graduated from Concordia back in the early 70s, but he's currently at the Center for Social Solutions at University of Michigan, and we're very proud to have him as one of our alums. But that's a little bit of an aside. I am Elijah Bender, Professor of History at Concordia College in Minnesota, not Montreal. That would be Concordia University in Montreal. So I am in Minnesota, although I wouldn't mind perhaps being in Canada at this point. But in any case, as Mike was describing, my specialty is pre-modern environmental history in Japan, and I mostly look at local society. However, at that time and place, there just happens to be a lot of samurai running around. And so, although I've never really considered myself to be a samurai historian, they do feature prominently in my work, and they are undoubtedly the thing that has the widest appeal of this era that I study. And so I take whatever opportunities I can to kind of lean into that. So tonight, I'm going to give you a talk about kind of my thoughts on how to approach samurai history with students, what students tend to know or not to know about this group, how to encourage interest in samurai history and Japanese history more broadly, while at the same time correcting a lot of historically inaccurate mythology. So first I'll give a very short overview of samurai history and some samurai mythology. Then I'll give an overview of some of my pedagogical techniques when teaching samurai history. We'll talk about Bushido for a while with an eye towards demystification and contextualizing. And then we'll wrap up with my thoughts on why samurai history is still relevant, even today, and even in the midst of the current goings-on in our world. So each of these sessions should be about 10 to 15 minutes long, and we'll break for Q&A and then a discussion between each one. Now, before we jump into this first section, I'd like to get a sense of our familiarity with Japanese history. If you could maybe put in the chat, what's your level of knowledge of Japanese history generally? Would it be useful to spend some time giving a historical overview, or would we rather kind of zoom through that a little quicker to spend more time on Q&A? If you could respond to that, I would appreciate it. Let me know if you would like a summary of the 47 Ronin incident, or if you would rather just jump into a discussion of the readings about the 47 Ronin. I did get a message as we were winding up that there might have been some problems uploading one of the readings. So let me know your thoughts on that. Okay, I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat here. I'm seeing some average, not much, not a whole lot. A couple people saying a good amount. One person only knows about Pearl Harbor. Fair enough. Historical overview, please. Okay, so yeah, we'll go ahead and do. I'll go ahead and spend some time on that overview. Let's kick things off then with. I would like to see your answer to this question. What is a samurai like? So first of all, let's throw out some adjectives. What is a samurai like? What is their attitude like? What is their... Okay, disciplined, skilled, loyal, fierce, brave. Oh, these are very good adjectives. Honorable, I love that one. Strong. Okay, how about some nouns? How would you describe, what are some nouns that you associate with samurai? I see warrior. Yes. Patriot, that's an interesting one. Strong. What does a samurai wear, and what do they use? What are some of their accoutrements? Male. Interesting. King. Okay. Almost not human. Swords. Yes. Sword. Good. Okay. Oh, somebody did their homework. Horseback and bow. Okay. All right. Good. So I like to start off most of my samurai classes with something like this. And as you might expect, when you do this with students, you'll get a lot of the kind of similar answers to what you all just gave, which are more or less our stereotypical kind of pop culture version of samurai. And in what is probably not surprising to any of you, virtually all of that is either embellished or largely a myth. Samurai are pretty self-interested in terms of actual historical samurai. Samurai did a lot of nasty things. They were mostly motivated by very prosaic desires, as are most people. Samurai are much more like mercenaries in the pre-modern period than these sort of selfless warriors who are, sacrificing for their lord or some cause. As I mentioned, somebody did get this one right, that their primary weapon is not not the sword, it's the bow for the vast majority of their history. For the vast majority of their history, they are mounted archers, not the kind of wandering swordsman with the hakama that you see up here in that image. Samurai also don't work for the emperor. Some of them are indeed elite. Many of them are not elite. And so, we have all of these kind of perceptions about samurai that don't line up particularly well to historical samurai. And I think that, when you're teaching samurai, certainly at the college level, probably at the high school level as well, when you wade into something like this, the initial tendency is to kind of throw up your hands and say, well, it's just all made up BS. Like where do we even start with, all of these kind of misperceptions? So two things. One is that a lot of these stereotypes about samurai have at least a kernel of truth. And second, most of the mythologizing of samurai is based upon those kernels of truth, but only appropriate to a particular era. And so for me as a historian, this is an especially important point to convey to students, that samurai history spans 1,300 years, give or take, depending on how you're counting. And so there is a huge amount of time, and samurai are vastly different at different points along that timeline. There's also huge regional and especially socioeconomic difference within this category of samurai that we project into the past. Another very important point is that it's easy to fall into the trap of, we have all these ideas about samurai, it's all pop culture nonsense, and we're just making up stories. Samurai mythologized themselves. They made up stories about themselves as well, all throughout that 1,300-year history. First through a literary genre called war tales, then in family and lineage histories, and then in later periods through various forms of pop culture. So the key point that I'm making here is that samurai mythology itself is nothing new. Now, clearly our contemporary version of it is specific to our historical moment, but it would not be fair to say, it would not be accurate to say that samurai mythology is a product of the 20th century or 21st century. So with that in mind, let's dive into the very, very basics of samurai evolution throughout some of these different historical eras. We're going to start in the 7th century, and I'm sorry that we're skipping a lot of background here, but again, we're zooming through 1,300 years of history in a few minutes. The thing you need to know at this time is this is a period in which the institutionalized state develops in the Japanese archipelago. The genesis of it is here in the 7th century. And this state is run by a group of several hundred elite lineages who are clustered in Western Japan in a region known as the Kinai, which is where Kyoto is. It's the red circle there on the Japan map. Now, if you know anything about aristocrats, you know that they have lots of servants who do things for them. And this is an era of bureaucratizing in Japan. And so all of the servants are formalized and organized according to the type of service that they provide to aristocrats in this era, when aristocrats are also bureaucratizing the state. Samurai are the group that provides muscle in that, of those service-oriented groups. They are everything from bodyguards to policemen to soldiers to assassins, and they work for the elite people who live in Kyoto, or at the time it would have been Nara or Heian, the city of Heian-kyo. So this is actually where the word samurai comes from. It is the classical Japanese verb saburao, which means to serve, although I should note that the word samurai is almost never used until the early modern period. What these people are referred to by is a variety of generic terms for warrior or fighter or gentleman. There's different ways to translate some of these terms. Now, beginning in the 8th century, but really accelerating in the 10th, the Japanese state starts to lose power vis-a-vis those individual aristocratic lines that we were just talking about. And the heads of those aristocratic lineages are able to leverage such power because they have built up these huge portfolios of landed estates all across the archipelago that function essentially as their private property. Again, huge amount of details that we're skipping over here, but these are called shoen, and that is usually translated as estate into English. But virtually no aristocrat actually lives on their shoen because they want to stay in the capital where all the hustle and bustle is. And so they hire small armies of people to act as their estate managers, law enforcers, tax collectors, defense forces, accountants, you name it. So from the 10th to about the 14th century, the vast majority of samurai worked for aristocrats in these roles out in the provinces. One of the main posts that samurai would often get in this system is called jito, which means literally the head of the land. And it's often translated as on-site manager or overseer, which again fits into their function as an employee, essentially, of a distant aristocrat in the capital. What we're looking at here is a map of a shogun estate from a much later period, but there you can see the different plots of it are sort of divided up and labeled. These shogun posts are pretty good gigs for samurai, and over time it became expedient for both samurai themselves and for aristocrats to make these positions de facto hereditary, right? So if there's a guy out in the province who's doing a good job, and he's approaching retirement, rather than look around for somebody else, like why not just hire his son who's already out there with him doing the work. So this becomes more and more entrenched over time. And it has the effect of shifting a little bit of leverage away from aristocrats in the capital towards samurai themselves, who are the ones who are on the ground managing these estates. And on the ground, very literally. They are the ones out, in the provinces. Aristocrats start to lose their position of dominance over several generations of this happening. Eventually, a big coalition of samurai win a war and set up their own government in eastern Japan. This is the beginning of the Kamakura Bakufu, or shogunate. Those are interchangeable terms, which is established in 1185. And so for those of you who have some familiarity with Japanese history, you will note 1185 as a crucial date. It marks technically the beginning of samurai rule, and I'm doing air quotes right now about samurai rule in Japan. It is a government that exists alongside the traditional aristocratic state, however. So the government in Kyoto is still around. And moreover, most samurai continue to work for aristocrats on their shoen even after 1185. They just get some additional perks from the Bakufu because it's sort of like the samurai have their own government who's able to advocate for them more effectively. And for the first time, you might say collectively, although I'm using that term very loosely. So this system is rather unwieldy. It's rather unstable. And eventually the samurai government completely subsumes the aristocratic one. And this is known as the Muromachi Bakufu, the second of three samurai governments. That happens in the early 14th century. The Muromachi order does not hold together very well either, and eventually things completely break apart in the 15th century. There's no effective central government at all, and the archipelago is ruled by regional samurai lords who have a bunch of smaller local samurai landlords under them. And there's a very long, very destructive period of civil war from about 1450 to 1600, and that is known as the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period in English. So these two eras overall, the samurai as managers era and the samurai as landlords era, is what we would consider medieval Japan. We might also call this the quote-unquote classical era of samurai. Towards the end of the 16th century, a series of ever larger and more successful coalitions of these regional warlords, daimyo, if you're familiar with that term, are able to bludgeon their opponents into submission. And a central state is reconstructed over a period of about 30 years, led by a succession of daimyo who are known as the unifiers. This would be Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. And they are up there in the left corner of the slide. The daimyo Tokugawa Ieyasu emerges as the victor. For those of you who have watched the recent Shogun miniseries on, AMC or FX, that would be the character of Toranaga in that series. He's Tokugawa Ieyasu. But a number of significant changes are implemented with regard to samurai. This is a real watershed moment. Armies are demobilized, for one thing. Samurai are removed from their provincial estates, and they are required to live in the regional capital cities of their respective lords, the daimyo, and they are given jobs in the daimyo's administration. In other words, samurai become a class of urban bureaucrats in the 17th century, and this is a huge shift. It's also noteworthy that up to this point, there has never been a formalized institutional designation of samurai before the very, very late 16th century. So for all of this period of time, when we talk about samurai in the pre-modern period, that's actually an anachronistic term. That is not an official status that anybody had prior to the late 16th century. But in the Tokugawa period, 17th century, samurai does become an official status, and you either are one or you are not, and you don't get to change that. Nobody does. If you are, you have certain privileges, but you also have some restrictions. For example, you cannot just go live out in a provincial village and become a farmer if you have samurai status. And the same is true for other classes of people, although they have more restrictions than privileges, as you might expect. So we just sprinted through about 1,300 years of history. Here is a kind of summary there. And so on the left, you'll see the labels that I was using. On the right is some descriptions, very kind of pithy descriptions of what a samurai is at that time. And if you're curious about the official era names of Japanese history, that's what's listed there on the left underneath. So I think that we kind of decided that we would do a 47 Ronin summary. And so let's have this question kind of lead us in that direction. What makes a good samurai? If we're talking about this long period of history where they've played all these different roles and centuries of historical development, how can we in any coherent way talk about what makes a good samurai? And the answer is, the short answer is that you really can't. And samurai themselves were actually unable to do this. And probably the best encapsulation of this, the best historical example of this, is indeed the 47 Ronin, or the Ronin of Akko, which is a real event that actually happened. And this occurs in 1703. So we're about a century into the Tokugawa period, which, remember, is an era in which what it is to be a samurai has changed drastically from the eras before. But what happens is that there is a event that kind of brings some of these questions to the fore about what it is to be a samurai and what's the proper role of samurai in this society. How this occurs is in the spring of 1701, there's an imperial embassy who comes to visit the shogun. At this time, the emperor of Japan still lives in Kyoto, and the shogun lives in Edo, which is now Tokyo. The shogun is the one who has more actual power, politically, economically, and so on. But the emperor never goes away. The emperor is still there, and the entire Japanese political economy is based on status. And the highest lineage, or the lineage with the highest status, is the imperial line. And so you can't get rid of the imperial line, otherwise the whole thing collapses. So this is why throughout the entire pre-modern period, nobody ever gets rid of the imperial line, even though through much of that era, emperors are not actually the most powerful people in Japan. And this is definitely true in the Tokugawa period. So the emperor is coming to visit the shogun. This is a big deal. And the ceremony is a big production, and in the weeks leading up to it, there is meticulous preparation. And there is a daimyo, so an elite samurai named Asano, who is in Edo, and he's required to participate in this ceremony. The person who is the MC of this ceremony is a samurai who works for the shogun. His name is Kira Yoshinaka. And so he is in charge of sort of telling everybody what the pomp and circumstance is going to be like, where you're supposed to stand, where you're going to sit. You know, when the shogun says this, you do that, etc., etc. For reasons that are unclear, Kira and Asano did not like each other, and on the day of the ceremony, Asano suddenly attacks Kira from behind with his short sword, and he yells, "This is for what has happened these past days." So there's a lot of theories as to what led up to this, but that's the image that you see here, which is from a movie that was based on a kabuki play of this incident, and so that's why it's really kind of stylized. But there is Lord Asano striking Lord Kira, you know, right as this ceremony with the emperor is taking place. So you talk about a breach of protocol. There's almost no more serious offense that you could have imagined, other than maybe attacking the shogun himself. But the shogun is absolutely furious, and he wants to really throw the book at Lord Asano. His advisors urge him to wait, but that very day, he orders Lord Asano to commit seppuku, which is a ritualized suicide, and he does that. He also takes away his domain, which is the worst thing that can happen to a samurai lineage, as well as all of the retainer samurai that work for him. And this is kind of a big deal because this kind of thing just doesn't happen. Everyone is really shocked. And I think that is pretty telling. The fact that this incident becomes so mythologized and remembered shows that it's a real outlier. But here's some of the issues that were raised contemporaneously. Who was in the right, who was in the wrong? Was the shogun's punishment of Lord Asano and his attainder, that is to say his confiscation of Lord Asano's domain, justified? Well, did him and Kira actually have a fight? Was Lord Asano incompetent by not killing Kira? Like, if he was a good samurai, maybe he should have just killed him, right away. Kira didn't fight back. Does that make him a bad samurai? So if he's a bad samurai, maybe the shogun shouldn't defend him. These are the kinds of things that contemporaneous commenters were thinking about. But Tsunayoshi, the shogun, decides to go ahead with the confiscation of Asano's domain, and this is going to end the Asano line. And so it is up to the chief retainer, who is a man named Oishi Kuranosuke, who takes over the process of submitting that domain to the shogun and basically dispersing all of the Asano samurai. And he, on the eve of that official handover, he meets with the retainers of the Asano domain, and he says, we can just go along with everything, which means for them that they will become ronin, which is not a glamorous thing to be, actually, in the Tokugawa period. It just means that you're a samurai who's out of a job, and you will basically become a beggar. So not particularly a good option there. They can refuse to turn over the domain to the shogun's officials and entrench themselves in the castle and fight, which basically would mean like a suicide mission. They can turn over the castle, but then continue to petition, like through the legal system, to have the Asano domain reinstated, or they can carry out their lord's final wish, which they're sort of guessing what his final wish was, but carry out Lord Asano's wish to kill Kira and avenge his death. Basically, all of the samurai of the Asano domain choose to just go along with the decision that's been handed down. They leave, they become ronin, that's it. They just obey the shogun. A few of them, 47 to be exact, decide to follow Oishi in this mission to avenge Lord Asano's death and kill Kira. And so, for the next couple of years, they disperse because they're all under surveillance, and they pretend like they have moved on with their lives, but they have a kind of secret code that they're waiting for, that Oishi is going to send out to them. And when that happens, they know that it's time to get back together, and they're going to launch an assault on Kira's mansion. So that takes 2 years, and Oishi goes to great lengths to pretend like he is not plotting anything. He becomes a kind of public drunkard, and he even like disowns his family, and it's just really messy. But he apparently does sell it, and so the time comes for the co-conspirators to meet back up. They do that in Edo, and they launch a night attack on Kira's mansion, and they are successful. They sneak in and murder him in his bedroom. That happens in the 12th month of 1702. And what we're looking at here is some, these are 19th century depictions of the attack itself. They then take Kira's head to Senkakuji Temple, which is where Lord Asano is buried, or where his grave is, and they turn themselves into the authorities, and they tell the shogun's officials that we're going to wait here at the temple until you all come and get us, and whatever the decision is, we will abide by it. Tsunayoshi is still the shogun. He is really upset by this. Once again, he's kind of lost face, and so he orders all of them to commit seppuku. Overnight, this story becomes wildly popular, and so here, this really nicely illustrates that samurai have kind of always mythologized themselves, but this incident is highly unusual. It's also very dramatic. I mean, it's got, all of these kind of elements to it. And so it becomes dramatized right away. The Bakufu tries to prevent like kabuki plays and puppet theater from depicting this story, but they can't. There's just an avalanche of, stories about this that come out right away. It also gives rise to some very interesting commentaries, which I gave you some excerpts of that from the Sato book, Legends of the Samurai. And the reason that I wanted us to take a look at those is because it shows that at this time, this is early 18th century, right, 1703, there is no consensus about what it means to be a good samurai. There's all of these different opinions about what Lord Asano should have done, what Kira could have done, was Oishi in the right or wrong, should the shogun have punished the ronin or not? And I think that this is a really crucial thing to understand, especially when we're talking about the so-called way of the samurai. So I can give a kind of overview of those, or if there are some specific questions about these different commentaries or takes about the 47 Ronin incident, I'd be happy to discuss that with all of you. I do see two questions that have been up there for a while. Are there still samurai these days? There are descendants of samurai lineages that are still around, but no. Samurai ceased to exist as an official status in the late 1870s. I had read that there were female samurai. Is that true? Yes, there were samurai women. Samurai did reproduce, and so they had to have wives, and their principal wives would have samurai status. If you're asking in terms of are there female samurai who were also warriors, there does appear to have been female warriors in pre-modern Japan. There definitely would not have been past about 1500 or so.
Dr. Bender, I have a question. You mentioned the 1870s. Could you give us a little more context surrounding the factors that led to the elimination of samurai as a particular social status or particular status in the 1870s?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, this is the birth of the modern nation state of Japan. So this is the beginning of the Meiji era, and Japan is trying to rapidly modernize. What we mean by modernize really is to become like a Western country, because there's tremendous pressure to resist Western imperialism. And so, the Japanese at this time are very well aware of what has happened in India and in China, and want to avoid that fate. And so they look to models such as the United Kingdom, continental Europe, to construct a constitutional republic in order to be accepted essentially on the world stage as a legitimate nation state. And part of that is converting status groups into citizens. And so that is indeed the end of samurai as an official status group.
All right, good deal. Thank you for that. And you mentioned earlier that there were distinctions based on socioeconomic class and different classifications. What were some identifiable differences between those classes? Say, for instance, if you were, existed among a higher, a more wealthy, class of samurai. What were the distinctions, and pick a time period and or an era, but were there identifiable differences that you could point out among the status of each level?
Yeah, so it's samurai in the pre-modern period. Their social relationships, their social and political relationships are very hierarchical and very vertically integrated. Samurai don't really cooperate what you might describe as horizontally. In other words, if I'm a kind of small-time samurai who works for a wealthy landowner, I don't see common cause with other small-time samurai. My ambition is sort of vertically integrated. You're working for someone, a more affluent lord, and you owe that person military service. And the way for you to get ahead and for you to get your lineage ahead is to perform good military service that will result in material rewards. So this is the thing that motivates pre-modern samurai. And there are everything down from a very kind of lower class what we would call a sort of foot soldier, all the way up to a wealthy, kind of landed gentry type of person who we would put in that category of pre-modern samurai. So there's a vast socioeconomic gulf between the bottom and the top. And that does continue into the early modern period, or the Tokugawa period. It's just that the lower level samurai are removed from their provincial estates and they're concentrated in these urban centers.
Good deal. Thank you for that. We have a few more questions. Brianne, I see your question about the Bushido or Bull article. I'll hold off on that one because I know we're going to get into that topic here shortly. But there was a question about the movie The Last Samurai, about the historical accuracy at all. That I guess any other comments that you would like to make about that particular
yeah, basically nothing. And I not even the costuming really. So I have a lot of students, of course, who they know that movie, and it's got exciting action sequences and all of that. Outside of the context of the Japanese military employing Western experts to teach them modern, that is to say, mechanized, industrialized warfare. That context is indeed correct, but that's about where it kind of ends in terms of historical accuracy for that film.
And one final question for now. This question about women as samurai. The question from Nestor is were women involved in leadership positions or involved in other areas, whether it's creation of uniforms, diet, other major contributions in or outside of the realm? So any particular roles?
Depends on what level of samurai we're talking about. If we're talking about kind of mid or lower level samurai, then samurai women would probably be involved in some household work and things of that nature. If we're talking about very wealthy samurai, then absolutely not. They have servants to do that. Also, there's no such thing as a uniform. Samurai don't have uniforms. One of the things about samurai is that you have to stand out. So they're very much not like a modern military. They're mercenaries. You get ahead by you doing something individually on the battlefield that's worth getting a reward from your superior, and so you have to stand out. This is why samurai have like distinct helmets, for example. Samurai had they would have distinct fletchings on their arrows, so that they could be easily identified, like I shot that person, and so on. In terms of leadership positions, again, there would be a huge difference between a lower level and upper level samurai house, but there are many examples in the pre-modern period of samurai women stepping in, like say in the wake of a succession dispute, and running the show until a new heir for the lineage is solidified. This is hard to quantify, though, because in all of the sources, everything is written through the lens of patriarchal rule. So we know that samurai women had huge influence, but it's like in the background. You have to read sources really carefully to try to suss that out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for everyone else who have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. I see there are a few others there, but we're gonna, in the interest of time, we'll move on and we'll come back to them a little bit later. Also, shout out Yinyi, who said that of women, they were strong and brave, often using weapons like the naginata. Women weren't usually in the spotlight, but they definitely played an important role in the culture. So, good deal. Thank you, Dr. Bender. Yeah, we're fine to move on.
Okay. So Let's talk about balancing myth busting and engagement. Here we have a quote. In 1633, Japan closed its borders to the outside world completely. Citizens would never see a white face nor any face that wasn't Japanese. This is how the 2023 Netflix show Blue Eye Samurai begins. So this would be set in the early Tokugawa period, 17th century. And you will not be surprised to hear that basically all of that is incorrect. Borders were not completely closed. It's rather anachronistic to call islanders citizens in the 17th century in Japan. And in fact, many people saw a non-Japanese face, including even some white faces. But I'm not here to tell you that a period drama lacks nuance. We know that this happens, and kind of who cares? To our chagrin, it probably doesn't. In the grand scheme of things, it probably doesn't matter that The Last Samurai is not historically accurate. So what if a fictional story with a historical setting, and one that's made for a Western audience, I might add, fudges some historical details? Why is this particularly frustrating, though, for those of us who study Japan and samurai specifically? Are we just more curmudgeonly than our colleagues in other fields of history? That is possible. But I would offer two additional explanations. One is that there's probably more samurai around the world now than there have ever been in the past. Of course, there's no actual samurai in terms of there being people who hold that as a status. But if we count representations of samurai and people who identify with some aspect of samurai culture broadly conceived, they're everywhere. Here's just a smattering of where you might encounter samurai or samurai discourse. So we've got Onimusha up there. We've got NHK Taiga drama, Sanada Maru, Shogun I talked about. There's the Japanese national baseball team that's called Samurai Japan. Assassin's Creed Shadows just came out recently, and it's set in Japan, and there's a samurai in there and a ninja as well. So we can't escape this kind of combination of ignorance and preconception that our students come into our classrooms with. What do we do with this? Now, to be fair, I'm sure we can list a range of historical subjects or themes where this is the case. I mean, the U.S. Civil War comes to mind. But why are these problems so acute in Japanese history? The second reason why misperceptions of this history are so problematic is that the history itself kind of reinforces some of the worst stereotypes about Japan and the West. It freezes Japan in time and enables a kind of historical amnesia, particularly of the Japanese imperial period. There's all of these false equivalencies that are drawn between Japanese history and, say, medieval European history. But going back to what we talked about earlier, these are based on kernels of truth, but at particular time periods. So someone that point that someone had made about female samurai training with naginata, that's true, but in the 18th century. That would not have been in the 18th century. One of the ways in which samurai women practiced martial arts was to train with naginata. It was not considered to be like they weren't allowed to train with swords, but that's where that comes from. So some other things as they relate to these stereotypes in samurai media, Japan did restrict contact with the outside world in the early modern period. Japanese thinkers have indeed framed contact with the West as this kind of civilizational clash. And because of that, and because of the way that historical memory developed in Japan itself, samurai are stuck in this kind of early to mid 20th century, largely Orientalist moment. And a lot of the pop culture that we and our students consume are kind of recycled versions of that. There is a lot of strains of Japanese exceptionalism. that filters through in these stories. And because samurai have an outsized influence on perceptions of Japan's past, oftentimes they're a proxy for pre-modern Japan generally, this means that readings of Japanese history become similarly colored in the minds of our students. They see Japan, they see Japan's past through samurai. Now we can, some people do, take this opportunity to go around bursting bubbles all the time, right? Like that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, and give students the hard truth. And I think when we do this, it really risks damaging student engagement. I was once a TA in a history of Japan class for a very accomplished Japan scholar, and a student asked in this class, well, what about ninja? How much of that is real? And the teacher's response was nothing. It was all made up by comic book authors in the early 20th century. And I could literally see the light like drain from the student's eyes. It was like, that's it. Why am I going to be in this class for the rest of the semester? Like, my joy has been just deflated. So I think that was a mistake. For that reason, but also the fact that, as you can see in this slide here, it's not strictly true to say that ninja don't exist. This is a train in the Japanese city of Iga, where a lot of the ninja legends come from. And look at all the ninja there. The whole train is painted with ninja. So ninja, in some sense, do absolutely exist. The entire this entire town is based on ninja tourism. Right now, for obviously what I'm talking about here is like ideas about ninja are very much real. So I think that if we just tell students, well, it's all made up, that's a kind of distortion as well. And we really need to unpack the myths themselves and then try to direct students back to the historical context of what is the work that this story was doing at the time. What is the work that ninja mythology does for us today? Why is that so popular and widespread? You've all heard the saying, truth is stranger than fiction. I kind of try to take that approach when I teach this topic. That is to say, let students enjoy, some of the pop culture stuff and the mythology, and say, use that as an avenue to be like, well, wait until you get into the actual richness and complexity and nuance where that story comes from, and its changes and evolution over time that has brought it to us. So I think about trying to invite students into that larger world, and samurai are a great way to get students thinking about the gap between the historical record itself and myth. If we can recognize reasons for myth making and its influential historical role, that says something pretty profound about the people who are making those stories. And so this is something that we do. Basically, every theme of history has this gap. It just so happens that in the case of samurai, the gap is really noticeable. So I love to use samurai in that way, but then to get students thinking about, well, what kind of gap, what kind of similar gap exists, for example, in, say, our understanding of the U.S. Revolution and someone like George Washington. I think I'm going to skip through some of the, well, I'll do this one really quickly just to give an example of how I illustrate the sort of kernel of truth that then becomes distorted through historical memory. Earlier when we were doing our what is a samurai like, a lot of people said, honor, samurai are honorable. And if you hear that from a student and then you say, well, that's not true, samurai weren't really honorable, they did a lot of nasty stuff, and they were more like mercenaries than honorable warriors. Well, that's also a bit of a distortion, because even historical medieval samurai had a very particular sense of honor. It just operated in a completely different way than what we might expect. So one example of this is in the mid 15th century, there's a samurai named Ashikaga Mochiuji He's related to the Shogun, and he's the highest ranking warrior out in eastern Japan. He lives in the circle there on the right. And he has a disagreement with the Shogun, who lives in Kyoto, which is the circle on the left there. In 1432, Mochiuji sends his retainers to put down a rebellion in a neighboring province from where he lives, despite the Shogun telling him not to do this. The punishment for that disobedience comes 6 years later in 1438, when the Shogun does not allow Mochiuji to use a name character when his son comes of age. So this would be a big honor, right? If you get to use part of the Shogun's name in your name, and the Shogun doesn't let Mochiuji do this for his son. Mochiuji then attempts to overthrow the Shogun. He kicks all of the Shogun's officials out of his domain, and he proclaims himself independent from the Shogun. There's another war. He's ultimately defeated after 2 years of warfare. So there's samurai honor in action. All of that happened because somebody didn't get to spell their name the way they wanted to. Now, we're being a little bit reductive here, of course, but it shows how this is how samurai honor actually functioned. This guy was insulted. He was not given the sort of pride of place that he felt he was deserving of. And that's the thing that kicked off this battle between him and the Shogun. So yeah, that's honor functioning, but it's really different from the loyalty to your lord above all else, the pop culture version of samurai honor. And there's tons of examples of this kind of thing. But I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I wanted to kind of focus on an overview of the way that we can approach that with our students. One of the things that I try to do is to get students to express their interest in samurai in a bit more sophisticated way. So, I like samurai because medieval battles are cool and it's really awesome. Well, maybe you're not interested in samurai per se, but you're interested in pre-modern warfare or pre-modern technology. Or maybe you're interested in the causes of violence and, what leads to order or disorder in a society. Maybe you're actually interested in power relations and how that manifests in a particular society. You can do this in a lot of ways, right? I think samurai armor is cool. Okay, well, maybe you're actually interested in aesthetics. Maybe you're interested in like craft production, cultural studies, historical memory. Some people have asked about, women samurai. Maybe you're actually interested in gender relations in pre-modern societies. If it's Bushido, maybe you're actually interested in nationalism or ideas about masculinity. And so I find that can be a really effective way to kind of get students to think about their own interests as historians. If I was to actually study this thing, what is the theme that I would actually be studying? I always try to validate whatever, I am a shameless exploiter of samurai in terms of like, if it gets students to get in front of me and take a Japanese history class, and it's because they like anime or, they like some samurai video game, like that's terrific. I'm so glad you're here. Let's talk about, what you like about that. I find I've had the most success when I actually jump into the primary sources as quickly as possible and work backwards from there. This was counterintuitive to me at first because the way I was trained was you do all of this kind of wind up in order to understand the primary source that you're going to read. I do the opposite with my students. I give them a primary source. They don't know what the heck is going on, and then we work backwards from there. And it's a great way to get them to see that, like, oh my goodness, wow, this world is so much weirder and different and more complicated than I thought it was, based on me playing the new Assassin's Creed game. I mentioned this earlier, but reinforced to students that samurai told stories about themselves. Samurai have a long tradition of referring to classical tales about other heroic samurai from the past that are completely embellished and mythologized, and they've been doing that all through their history. And then I also try to kind of gently overwhelm them a little bit, just to keep them curious about things. That can be really effective if you sort of say like, wow, well, here's this thing that you're interested in. It would be really hard to answer that question, wouldn't it? And they go kind of like, oh yeah. Okay, so think about like how are you going to find the answer to that question? This might be useful to all of you, but when it comes to English language sources, this is probably the biggest limitation, right, in teaching samurai history, is that there's a lot of great stuff out there, but it's almost all in Japanese. So when we're teaching in English, if you're trying to jump into primary sources as quickly as you can, the list on the left there is some really high quality translated primary sources. And I'm sure that I could dig up a few more, but to be honest with you, that's about it. This is a real deficiency in the field. On the right is a list of authors who write specifically about samurai in English. And the reason why that list is a little short is because most scholars who do pre-modern Japan are not specifically samurai historians. That's not really a category that exists, again, because it's not really a coherent category. So if you want to be a scholar of pre-modern Japan and you say, I'm going to go study samurai, like, well, what do you mean? Like, samurai when? What about samurai? What kind of samurai? Are you talking about elites? Are you talking about, lower down people? Like, what region of Japan? And so it's actually we don't have a whole lot of good kind of overviews or surveys of samurai history in English. If you look at that list on the right and notice that, wow, there's only one woman on that list, this is also another big limitation. The field of Japan studies has been predominantly male, especially when it comes to pre-modern Japan. And for all of the progress that we've made, that continues to be the case, especially when you're talking about people who specifically publish about samurai stuff. The last thing I would point out here is that when you're teaching students and you want them to dive into this literature, you have to be very, very careful about the types of secondary sources that they're using, because in English in particular, there is a whole lot of stuff that is not very high quality out there. I don't want to name any names, but I will just say that when it comes to samurai, if you want a historically accurate quality treatment, you basically have to have something that's by an academic press. If it's published by a trade press, I would not recommend it to students. And so this can be really confusing to students, because they'll find a book at a library and it's, here's Zen and the Way of the Sword, and I want to write a paper about that. And that's not a quality piece of scholarship. It's not based on accurate readings of primary texts. And I try to steer students away from that. I also wanted to mention, in terms of resources, that there's a great resource online called Japan Past and Present, where you can search for Japan scholars who do their work in English. This is run by some folks that I know out of UCLA. And I think that most Japan scholars, especially people who study the pre-modern period, because we're always kind of playing second fiddle to modern Japan. But most Japan scholars, if you sent them an email, asked them a question, asked them for some advice about recommending sources or books or what have you, they would love to hear from high school teachers, community college teachers, other professors who specialty is not Japan. And that's a resource that you might consider if you haven't already. Just reach out to some people and say, hey, I have a student who's really, they're really into the Last Samurai and they want to do a paper about Bushido. Do you have any suggestions about where I could point them? With that, maybe we'll take some questions or ideas that you might have.
Perfect. Actually, as we move into the next section, Brianne's question from earlier. In the Bushido or Bull article, it mentions how Inazo Notobe's book popularized the idea of Bushido. Mm-hmm. But in a class that I'm in, it was said that Notobe actually coined the term. Do you believe Notobe coined the term Bushido in 1899, or did this term exist before he wrote Bushido, the Soul of Japan?
Excellent question. And for those of you who had a chance to look at Oleg Benesh's book, Inventing the Way of the Samurai, he talks quite a bit about Notobe. That is a great book, by the way. It is the best treatment of the subject in English, so it's extremely useful. But Notobe did not coin this term. That term dates back to the early 17th century from a source called Koyo Gunkan, which is a great example of samurai mythologizing about themselves even in the pre-modern period. Now, what Notobe did was, or I should say that the term Bushido is basically not used at all until about 1900. So it is a term that exists, but it is very obscure and not common until around 1900. And Notobe's big contribution, you might say, to Bushido discourse is that he is the one who internationalized ideas about Bushido. And he particularly has an influence in the mid and late 20th century. So when he wrote The Soul of Japan, it had a little bit of an influence, but not much. He was not what you might call one of the more prominent Bushido thinkers in his own era, but he becomes enormously popular, especially after the 1980s.
Good deal. Thank you so much for that. Question from Andres. What does Yasuke, the African samurai, his story, what does the story tell us about race, identity, and social mobility in feudal Japan? Great question.
Yeah, that is a terrific question. I would preface this by saying that we would love to have more sources about Yasuke to be able to answer that question with greater detail. Yasuke appears in just a handful of historical sources. I think it's maybe 4 or 5. But you're right. Fascinating, event where this Black African travels to Japan with Jesuit priests. Oda Nobunaga, who is an elite samurai, is the most elite samurai at the time, becomes really fascinated by this person, and he makes him a retainer. And so one of the things that I think this reveals about samurai in this era is that it is what makes you a samurai is the fact that you have a military obligation to a lord. So it's really not dependent upon your race or ethnicity or even your ability to speak Japanese. It's the fact that you are in this kind of hierarchical master-retainer relationship that's based on military service. In terms of the Japanese conceptions of race in the pre-modern period, I unfortunately can't really do that a whole lot of justice here, other than to say that most of their conceptions of otherism is based on kind of classical Chinese ideas about barbarians. And so the closer that you are to the center of civilization, which is the sovereign, the Chinese emperor or the Japanese emperor, these sovereigns have a civilizing influence. And for those further out from that, the further out you go, the more barbarous you are going to be.
Thank you. And also thank you for that question as well. Cosette had a question about, she wanted to know if you have any anime suggestions or recommendations for resources or media that's helpful for kids, giving kids more or less helpful historical insight. Resources or media, anime that offers more helpful historical insight for younger audiences.
Yeah, that is a very good question. When it comes to anime, they're really, I cannot think of an anime that does a good job of trying to be historically accurate. So unfortunately, I would say that is kind of a dead end, which is why it's so important to validate the interest that they have and to historicize whatever it is. That is to say, okay, you're interested in this samurai anime, but this is a product of the mid or late 20th century imagination, and what is appealing about that? Why do we like these kind of lone warrior, super skilled figures so much? Like, what is the appeal of that? And sort of treat it as an artifact of its era of production rather than a useful historical information. There are a couple of documentaries. These would be less appropriate for like younger kids, but like in high school, a couple of documentaries in English that are pretty good. If you'll forgive some shameless self-promotion, I'm actually in one of them. It's on Netflix. It's called Age of Samurai. And it's a little bit sensationalized, but to their credit, the producers of that series, they got Japan scholars, and I think they did a pretty good job of trying to present a historically accurate account of it. It would be the late 16th century. Again, remember that it's kind of impossible to give like an overview of what is a samurai, because there's a completely different answer to that question depending on like what era we're in.
Thank you for that. And I don't consider that shameless self-promotion. I actually was, I was going to mention that earlier. I haven't had a chance to check it out, but it's on my list for this weekend. So hopefully I get to check it out. So thank you for mentioning it. Would you like to move on with additional remarks before we close? Or
yes, I know we're coming to the end here, so I'm sorry that I'll kind of zoom through a couple things here.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, you'll be fine. If anyone needs to log off, then feel free to do so. But we would love to hear about this next section. So thank you.
All right. Okay. Fair enough. So let's talk about Bushido for a little bit. The giant samurai-shaped elephant in the room, which is probably I bet a lot of you have encountered this in your classroom in various ways. Maybe kind of think of your answer to these questions, and we can pick these up in a few minutes. But I would be curious to know what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced when you teach samurai or Japanese history. We've talked a little bit about some of the stereotypes you've come across. I'm not surprised to hear that a lot of this comes from anime and video games. And again, I wish that there was an easy recommendation that I could give that would be, here's a nice kind of more historically accurate game or anime series or what have you. Unfortunately, they're just not really out there. But another thing that we can talk about is the association of Bushido and interest in Japanese history with the Second World War. Now, this is something that I encounter all the time teaching undergraduates. If I had $1 for every time, a prospective history student told me that, I really like World War II. I probably would have been able to retire already, but we can't avoid this, right? And again, I never want to shut down a student's enthusiasm. Okay, great. You're interested in the Pacific War? That's terrific. Let's get into that. For those of you who had a chance to look at Oleg's book, you'll know that one of his key points is that Bushido is not a pre-modern phenomenon. So whenever you have conversations with students about this, if that's what they're interested in, I would encourage you to really just kind of forefront that. Like, yes, Bushido is absolutely a thing. It's associated with samurai. It draws from historical memory of samurai. It is not a pre-modern thing. So if we were to go back in 1350, right, and start looking around for all of the samurai who are doing Bushido, it doesn't exist. One of the things that Oleg's book does really well is it shows how the discourse of Bushido draws on different iterations of samurai throughout time, and then it kind of like mixes and matches interpretations of samurai that fit the historical moment. So this is really useful, again, in getting students to think about history is not a static thing, right? History is all about understanding change over time and why things change over time. And if there's one thing that I would like my students to take away from my Japanese history classes when it comes to samurai or Bushido or anything else, is that those things evolve, and our perceptions of them evolve as well. Here's a quick kind of the eras tour of Bushido. This is all based on Oleg's book, but the discourse of Bushido, what Barish calls, he calls this an invented tradition, which all traditions are invented at some point. But what he means by that is that it's invented in the sense that there's this idea that is formulated and then it is projected back in time. So a discourse of Bushido coalesces in the early Meiji period, the 1870s, and then it is presented as this long-standing, sort of cultural thing that goes back into time immemorial. The reason for that in the 1870s is that Japanese thinkers are trying to draw parallels between the Japanese past and the Western past. In particular, to draw parallels between the emerging modern Japanese nation state and Britain. Britain is the top dog of 19th century imperialism, and so if you can say that, like, hey, all of the stuff that the British have in their history, well, we have a version of that too. Wouldn't that put us kind of on par with them? And also, it's a way to separate Japan from the rest of East Asia. So we're not like the Chinese, who are totally getting their butts kicked right now. We're not like the Indians, right? We're not like the Koreans, etc. So that early Meiji version of Bushido is, it's really all about kind of these Victorian parallels. There's a boom in Bushido discourse from about 1895 to 1905. If you know some of the basics of Japanese history, you'll know that that's when Japan first acquires its colonial possessions. 1895, in the Sino-Japanese War, it gets Taiwan as a colonial possession. And so Bushido really becomes a version of Japanese exceptionalism at that point. Our ideas about our wondrous and glorious past that sets us apart from the rest of East Asia have been validated by our victory over China in 1895 and then Russia in 1905. And so Bushido is essentially Japanese exceptionalism in that era. It takes a more nationalist and expansionist term after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, which is really momentous because Japan has defeated a Western power, and they're very proud of that. This is kind of their moment of arrival on the world stage, if you will, as an imperial power, and they expect to be recognized as such by the Western imperialists. That progress, you might say, is interrupted a bit after the First World War, because the First World War is, it sort of reveals the failures and limitations of Western imperialism, and it's kind of like, oh well, this is where all of that leads. So there's a period through the 1920s where that is very much out of vogue. The Bushido discourse, really loses popularity from about the end of the First World War up until the 1930s. But then it becomes what Benesch calls Imperial Bushido from the 1930s onward, which is very much centered around Japaneseness as being a relationship to the emperor, right? What is it to be Japanese? It's that we have this wondrous imperial tradition, and to be a good Japanese citizen is to serve the emperor. And there's a whole discourse that evolves from the 1930s onward that's very militaristic. How do you serve the emperor? Well, if you're a soldier, that's where all of that sort of selfless sacrifice and fighting till the death ideas are developed. So that's a product of the 1930s and 40s. I think it's really important to emphasize that, and it's that's why I added Carl Friday's article. Carl Friday is a historian of the early medieval period, the Kamakura period, and so this is an older article, but he writes about how the imperial Bushido of the Second World War era is a product of that era. It really has no connection to pre-modern samurai. In the post-war period, for the first couple decades after 1945, Bushido had to be sort of separated from the imperial ideology, right? Because that was very much, this sort of ended, the imperial project ends in disaster for Japan. And so Japan moves away from that. Bushido discourse actually becomes more like if I'll go back to this slide, it becomes more like the early Meiji Bushido discourse of, here's this wondrous kind of tradition that we have that sort of sets us apart from other places, particularly other Asian nations. And that allows for it to become useful once again, in the sense of, Bushido is not militaristic, but it's a kind of cultural and spiritual revival, right? Here's this great tradition from the past, and we've all sort of gone soft by losing it. This is what fuels a lot of the post-war samurai films of like the 1970s on. And many of you are probably familiar with this guy, Mishima Yukio, who is perhaps the most iconic example of this sort of mid-20th century version of Bushido. He's very much, if I had to kind of boil down his ideology, he's a make Japan great again type of guy. Men need to be manly men again. Get in there and, hit the gym, work out, look at the biceps on this dude, do some swordsmanship. That's what it's all about. So post-war Bushido is, it's almost always a right-wing project. It's thoroughly reactionary. the people who talk about this, in a kind of serious way or as a prescriptive idea for modern Japan. Maybe I'll stop there and take some questions.
Okay. Question for you. Speaking of Zen in the way of the sword, I've never
Mhm.
heard of this text, but referring to the subject matter, I want to ask how much of the samurai quote unquote code or
Mm.
for lack of a better word, was influenced by elements of Mahayana Buddhism
Mhm.
in regard to influences on a samurai's way of existing.
Yeah, very good question. So the only type of Buddhism, or I should say all of the types of Buddhism that come to Japan, or indeed all of East Asia, is Mahayana Buddhism. Hinayana Buddhism is basically never makes it to East Asia. I mean, it does here and there. There's pockets of it, but it doesn't really take off. So all of the sects of Buddhism in Japan are of the Mahayana variety. And by far the most popular in the pre-modern version is Amidism. This is Pure Land, the Pure Land Buddhism, where you pray to the Amida Buddha and you will be saved. The Amida Buddha is a Buddha of salvation that in your time of need, if you pray earnestly, the Buddha will take you to the Western Paradise, which is it's like the Buddhist heaven. And so the vast majority of people in pre-modern Japan were Pure Land Buddhists. That included samurai. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because samurai are in a dangerous profession. Their job is deadly, and if you have this sort of savior figure that you can call on, that's pretty appealing. So I think that in terms of how does this influence samurai's ideas about the world, or a samurai code, or just sort of how they understand their place, it influences everybody. I mean, this has, Pure Land Buddhism is the way in which most people in pre-modern Japan understand cosmology and their religion, and their deities, and so on.
All right. And we will read one final question before we close out from Heidi. Thank you, Heidi. In the article, Bushido or Bull, it talks about the code of the samurai. Can't we define who samurai are, regardless of a time period, based on that perceived code?
No, there is no code of the samurai. So this is, I think, this would be a really important thing that we can try to get students to see, that if you're looking for a samurai code, there is no such thing. And if you remember, when we talked about the 47 Ronin, there's all of these different interpretations about how a samurai should behave. They can't agree on that. And this is in an era in which being a samurai is more formalized and more institutionalized than it's ever been. And there still is no such thing as a samurai code. Now, what we can do is you can look at the Japanese legal system. There are laws, and there are laws that apply to things like armed conflict, or things like, what do you do if there's a dispute, who adjudicates, and some of those are issued by elite samurai to their retainers. If this happens, here's what the punishment's going to be. If two of my retainers have a feud, this is what the punishment is going to be. Those are specific to different samurai lineages, different time periods, different regions of Japan. And so here's a great example of how the actual truth, the actual history of a samurai code is way more complicated, nuanced, and I would argue interesting than saying, here's the text that is the samurai code.
All right. That's all the questions we have for now. Thank you so much.
I would like to end with some thoughts on why samurai are still important to study. I talked already about how they're a great example of this gap between myth, or what we might call historical memory, and the historical record. Of course, this happens with lots of different things, but samurai are a particularly clear example. It's a great way to introduce students to the idea, that it's fun, it's interesting. Students generally like samurai, or many of them do. But then you can say, hey, this happens with things like the Second World War as well. This happens with things like memories of the U.S. Civil War. What are the ways in which there is a gap there between how we mythologize that history and the actual historical record? I think this is crucial in our moment right now, especially as there's these pushes, from the powers that be for so-called patriotic education and so on. I mean, what is that if not, mythologizing or being very selective in terms of historical memory? Samurai are a great lens for analyzing masculinity. Pre-modern samurai are thoroughly patriarchal. The modern Bushido discourse is thoroughly patriarchal. The parallels to the current online manosphere are uncanny. I mean, so a lot of Mishima's works have been translated, and like he would fit right in, with an Andrew Tate or something. I'm convinced that this is one of the reasons why samurai have so much international appeal, is because they've become these kind of emblems of rugged individualism and the sort of stoic but deadly masculinity. We're looking here at Mifune as Yojimbo in the classic Kurosawa film. He's this kind of rough and tumble lone wanderer, right? Many of you probably know that Kurosawa's films had a huge influence on a generation of filmmakers in the West that did Westerns, Clint Eastwood and these types of stories. Even later films like the Bruce Willis one there. And so this is one of the ways in which the samurai historical memory is so like adaptable and updatable, right? Because you can sort of massage that for the current historical moment, and you have these charismatic figures, right, that appeal in this way. Samurai are a great example of how a pre-modern history can be co-opted for a nationalistic and authoritarian movement. There's quite a bit of overlap between like the imperial Bushido rhetoric of the 1930s on and make America great again, essentially, right? This is American exceptionalism. This is a selective view of American history, and that's exactly what Imperial Bushido of the 1930s and 40s was. It's a kind of invented tradition and a idea of a sort of quintessential nature that stretches far back in time and is attached to a certain ethnicity, is attached to a certain genesis that then serves as a foundation for exceptionalism. And in the case of Imperial Bushido, 1930s, 1940s, that's the crucial ideological foundation that then mobilizes a very jingoistic and reactionary politics. Samurai are a great lens for analyzing power relationships. They, as I mentioned before, they're thoroughly hierarchical. And especially if you're a socioeconomic historian, their identity and power in the pre-modern period is based on control of property. It's all about landed property. The difference between status and class in early modern Japan, when samurai become removed from that landed property, shows us that you can be a high status person, but not have high class. This is the position that many samurai find themselves in because they are no longer the local gentry. They are no longer the local landed gentry out in the provinces. They are fully dependent upon the patronage of their urban lords. And so many of them are impoverished, despite the fact that they are high status. They are above everybody else who's not a samurai. And then finally, I would say that samurai are extremely useful in unpacking gender and sexuality norms in pre-modern Japan. Samurai show up in the historical sources more than a lot of other groups, and so this can make them very useful for that. It's always a bit entertaining to explain this to my undergraduates that samurai practiced pederasty. They had a variety of same-sex arrangements that were acceptable and common. And as you might expect, at the undergraduate level, samurai topics attract a lot of young men, and they may have rather rigid ideas of manliness. And they can be a little bit confused when you tell them that, here's two medieval samurai who were fighting because they were former lovers, or here is some early modern samurai who got into a big brawl because they all wanted to have sex with a hot male kabuki actor. And then finally, samurai are just fascinating and fun. And if you do nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this webinar and get lost in some of these complexities, don't ever dampen student enthusiasm. That's the most important thing. If you have students who are excited about something, do whatever you can, right, to foster that.
Good deal, and thank you so very much, Dr. Benda. It has been a privilege and an honor to be here with you this evening. I look forward to continued conversations with you. We appreciate you accepting our invitation, and the teachers just looking through the chat right now all enjoyed our time together this evening. So very good, very good. And for those of you who are here, I encourage you to pass along this information to your friends. We have a considerable amount of resources that you can share, and of course, we will have this available on demand. So encourage your friends to come on back, friends and colleagues to come on back and check us out. I encourage you all to come back. April 22nd, The World Becomes What We Teach with Zoe Will, president of the Institute for Humane Education at Antioch University in New England. We will be back here at 7 o'clock p.m. on April 22nd. We look forward to seeing you all. For those of you who are out at LAUSD, I hope you continue to have an enjoyable and much needed break. We will see you soon. Take care and be well, my friends.